The Quan cartel thought they were throwing away a temporary wife. They stripped Naomi Ellison of her status, her home, and her husband, Taesung, leaving her with nothing but $17 and a $5 cabin in the Colorado wilderness. They expected her to beg. They expected her to freeze. But they forgot that Naomi carries her elegance like a weapon. And in the shadows of the high frontier, she's building something that will make the Quan family's billions look like pocket change. And if you want to see her rise, hit that like button and subscribe to Ari Armour Stories. Your support does more than just grow this channel. It tells the algorithm that stories of resilient, elegant Black women deserve to be told. It keeps our fire burning and ensures the Quan cartel doesn't get the last word. Now, let's go back to the mountain, where the work begins. The door didn't slam. That was the cruelest part. It simply clicked. A sound so small, so final, so utterly indifferent to the 7 years she had poured into the marble floors and silk-draped hallways behind it. Naomi Ellison stood on the stone steps of the Quan estate with a small leather pouch pressed against her ribs and the February mountain air cutting through her ivory cashmere like it had a personal grievance. $17. She'd counted it twice on the way down the grand staircase, each step a quiet humiliation dressed in architectural splendor. She didn't cry. She had decided that much before the attorneys finished speaking. What she did do was pause. 1 breath, 2, and adjust the single pearl earring at her left lobe. A reflex. A ritual. The same way a surgeon checks her instruments before stepping into the unknown. Behind her, through the rippled antique glass of the estate's front panel windows, she could feel him. Taesung Quan. Her husband. Her former husband as of 43 minutes ago. She didn't turn around. She knew what she would find if she did. Those obsidian eyes, cold and still as a frozen lake in January, watching her from behind the distorted glass the way a man watches a storm he believes he has already survived. He would be standing exactly 4 feet from the window. Close enough to see her. Far enough to convince himself he felt nothing. She knew his distances by heart. That was the tragedy of it. And the leather pouch had been his parting gesture, organized by his mother's personal assistant, handed to Naomi by a woman who wouldn't meet her eyes. Inside, her passport, her original Social Security card, and an envelope containing cash that someone had clearly counted to ensure it was just enough to be insulting. The Quan family had built their billions on precision. Even their cruelty was calibrated. Naomi descended the final step onto the frost-bitten gravel drive and heard the crunch beneath her heel like a period at the end of a sentence she hadn't been allowed to finish. A black car waited at the gate. Not a car service, she realized. Just a cab someone had called to make her disappearance efficient. The Colorado wilderness pressed in from every direction beyond the iron gate, ancient and enormous and completely unbothered by the Quan family's net worth. She walked toward it without hurrying, because Naomi Ellison had learned something in 7 years inside a gilded cage that the Quan family, in all their generational wealth and calculated power, had never bothered to understand. Elegance isn't about what you carry, it's about what you refuse to drop. The gate opened. She stepped through. And somewhere behind the rippled glass, Taesung Quan watched the only unpredictable thing in his life walk away, and made the first mistake of his careful, controlled existence. He let her. The man behind the counter at Silver Creek Mercantile had the kind of face that had spent decades deciding who was worth his time. He looked at Naomi's deed the way a doctor looks at an X-ray before delivering bad news, slowly, with the practiced sorrow of someone who charges for their sympathy. "All rock and no water," he said, sliding the paper back across the worn pine counter. "Whoever sold you this land did you no favors." He paused, then added, almost gently, "Or maybe they did it on purpose." Naomi didn't flinch. She had been stripped of a penthouse, a marriage, and a last name that opened doors in 7 countries. She was not going to be undone by a man in a canvas apron. She folded the deed with the same precision she once used to fold silk napkins at Kwan family dinners, tucking it back into her coat pocket like it was a deed to something sacred. Because it was. It mattered. "I'll take that axe," she said. Mattered. "I'll take that axe," she said. "And a sack of beans." The mercantile owner blinked. "Ma'am, did you hear what I said? That parcel won't grow a garden. The ground up there is more stone than soil. The creek that's supposed to border it dried up 3 seasons ago." "The axe," she said again, her voice carrying the quiet authority of a woman who had negotiated contracts worth more than this entire town. "And the beans." He wrapped them without another word. She had $17 left. The axe cost $9. The beans cost $2. She walked out of Silver Creek Mercantile with $6, an axe over one shoulder, and 50 pounds of dried beans in a canvas sack, down her boots crunching over frost-hardened ground toward a truck she'd borrowed from a woman at the bus station who'd taken one look at her and said, "You got that kind of face. The kind that pays people back." Naomi intended to. The Kwans had given her a joke for a property, a punchline dressed up as a settlement. She could almost hear Tae-sung's mother laughing over her tea. "Let her have the rocks. She can build herself a little nest and freeze." And what they didn't understand, what they had never understood about Naomi Ellison, was that she didn't need water handed to her. She knew how to find it. She knew how to go down far enough into the earth that even stone gives way. The truck climbed toward the tree line, toward the land they called worthless, and Naomi drove with one hand on the wheel and her jaw set like a woman who had already won. She just hadn't shown anyone the scoreboard yet. And the flour sack bit into her shoulders like a slow punishment, the rough burlap leaving angry red lines across her bronze skin with every step uphill. Naomi didn't stop. Stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling the full weight of what the Kwan family had taken from her. Not just the penthouse, not just the black card, but 3 years of herself she'd folded neatly into the shape of a wife they'd decided they no longer needed. The trail narrowed where the pines grew thick and territorial. Her heels, ridiculous, beautiful, the one small act of defiance she hadn't been able to abandon, had given up somewhere around the 2nd mile, snapping clean off the left shoe. She walked lopsided now, and somehow that felt appropriate. Everything in her life was lopsided at the moment. The cave announced itself with cold air before she ever saw the opening. A dark mouth carved into the granite face of the mountain. Patient and ancient and utterly indifferent to the fact that Naomi Ellison, who had once hosted charity galas for 400 guests, was about to call it home. She stood at the threshold and let the despair come. It rolled through her like a winter tide, cold and complete. And she didn't fight it because she had learned long ago that fighting a wave only exhausts you before it knocks you down anyway. She let it move through her. And then she squared her shoulders, flour sack and all, and walked into the darkness. The Kwans had stripped her down to $17 and a matchbook, and the particular kind of dignity that cannot be confiscated. They would learn, eventually, what that was worth. Subscribe, because what she finds in that cave changes everything. The sound found her before sleep did. Soft, rhythmic, patient as a heartbeat. Naomi pressed deeper into the cave's throat, following the noise with her fingertips trailing cold stone until they found it. A thin seam in the rock, weeping clean water into a natural basin no larger than her cupped palms. She tasted it without hesitation. Cold and mineral bright. Nothing like the flat luxury water Tae-sung's staff had poured into crystal glasses at $40 a bottle. This was better. She sat back on her heels and let herself think, really think, the way the Kwan boardrooms had trained her to, stripping sentiment from strategy until only geometry remained. The drip meant a spring source somewhere above, consistent pressure. Which meant this wasn't seasonal melt. It would run in February. It would run in March, when the passes were still buried and the wilderness felt like a held breath waiting to exhale something deadly. She pressed her palm flat against the cave wall and held it there. Warm. Not warm like fire. Warm like memory. Slow and stored and stubborn. The rock had been drinking sunlight for 10,000 years, and it kept the cold at bay the same way old money kept out hunger. Quietly, without announcement, through sheer accumulated mass. Thermal buffering. She'd read about it once in an architectural brief for a passive design resort project Quan Industries had ultimately rejected as insufficiently profitable. Their loss. Naomi allowed herself one small, private smile in the dark. She had water. She had warmth the frost couldn't fully reach. She had stone walls the wind couldn't negotiate with. The Quan family had given her $17 and expected a burial. What they'd actually given her was a foundation. The axe bit into the pine like it had something to prove. Naomi's first swing was wrong. She knew it the moment the blade glanced sideways off the bark, sending a shiver up her arms that rattled her teeth. She reset her feet in the snow, breathed, and swung again. This time, the wood gave. A clean white wound opened in the trunk, fragrant and bright, bleeding sap like the tree was finally honest about something. By the third tree, she had stopped apologizing with her grip. Her palms blistered on day 1 and cracked on day 2. By day 4, something harder was forming underneath. Not roughness exactly, but resolve, made physical. She worked in the early mornings when the cold was still a living thing pressing against her chest, and she found, to her own quiet surprise, that she didn't mind it. The cold asked nothing of her. It didn't need her to smile through dinner, or shrink herself into the corners of a house that had never been hers, or perform gratitude for a life she'd been assigned rather than chosen. She minded her posture through all of it. Old habit. Her mother's voice, low and certain. A woman who forgets her spine, forgets herself. So Naomi Ellison felled timber in the Colorado wilderness with her chin level and her shoulders back. Even if anyone had been watching from the tree line, they would have seen something almost absurd. A woman of obvious refinement dismantling a forest with the composure of someone arranging flowers. The cabin took shape against the rock face the way an argument takes shape. Slowly, then with sudden, undeniable logic. She'd chosen the site deliberately. The granite outcropping wasn't just shelter from the wind, it was architecture, already half-finished by geology. The cave mouth behind it was narrow, no wider than a doorway, and inside, the temperature held steady regardless of what the sky was doing. Cool in the afternoon heat. Cold, but not cruel, when the nights dropped. She chinked the gaps between the logs with moss and clay. She'd worked with her hands until it was the consistency of something between bread dough and conviction, and she sealed the cave's entrance into the back wall of the cabin like a secret kept on purpose. She called it the cool heart, not out loud. She wasn't talking to herself yet, and she intended to keep it that way. But in the ledger she kept in her mind, the one where she tracked resources, progress, and the slow accumulation of capability. That was its name. The cool heart of the house. The place where she would store what mattered, where the heat of the world outside couldn't reach. She stepped back on the 5th evening and looked at what she'd built. It wasn't beautiful. Not yet. But it was hers. Entirely, uncomplicatedly, legally hers. Purchased with $5 and defended with everything she had left. The Quan family had given her the wilderness thinking it was a sentence. She was beginning to understand it was a foundation. The black SUV appeared at the edge of the tree line just as Naomi was splitting her 3rd log of the morning. She heard it before she saw it. The expensive purr of an engine that had never known a dirt road. There's the soft crunch of premium tires negotiating terrain they were never designed for. She didn't stop swinging. The axe came down clean, Tae-sung Kwan stepped out of the vehicle in a charcoal wool coat that probably cost more than the cabin's deed. His driver stayed behind the wheel, engine running, heat presumably cranked to something civilized. He surveyed the clearing with those unreadable obsidian eyes. The woodpile, the small curl of smoke from the chimney, name the woman in the center of it all. And something moved across his face too quickly to name. Naomi set the axe head against the stump and straightened. She had dressed that morning with the same deliberate care she'd given herself in the Kwan penthouse. Her natural coils, full and uncompromising in the cold mountain air, were pinned back with a crown of pine needles she'd woven herself at dawn. Functional, yes, but arranged with the kind of precision that made functionality look like artistry. Tae-sung. She gave him her eyes, and when are you? Eyes and nothing else. He crossed the clearing slowly, reaching into his interior coat pocket. The envelope he produced was cream-colored, thick, the kind that serious money travels in. He held it out with both hands, a gesture that in another life might have looked like an offering. For transitional expenses, he said, while you determine your next steps. She looked at the envelope. Then she looked at her woodpile. 4 feet high, solid, built by her own hands over 3 days of learning what her body was actually capable of. She had blisters she was quietly proud of. She didn't reach for it. I have heat, she said simply. I have water. I have enough. Something shifted behind his composure, a hairline fracture in the marble. The temperature drops to single digits this week. Why this cabin isn't what? The question was mild, genuinely curious. Isn't what you would choose for me? She tilted her head slightly. You stop making choices for me, Tae-sung. The Kwan family saw to that. He stood there in his beautiful coat with his beautiful money and the weight of everything unsaid pressing the air between them flat. Naomi picked the axe back up. Drive safe, she said. The road ice is early up here. She brought the blade down, and the log split perfectly, 2 clean halves falling away from each other like a door opening. Behind her, after a long moment, she heard the SUV door close. She smiled at the wood grain and swung again. The hum came first. It started 3 days before the storm, a low-frequency vibration that Naomi felt more in her sternum than heard with her ears. The geothermal system cycling into its highest register, as if the mountain itself had read the forecast and decided to prepare. She'd learned to trust that sound. She'd learned to trust a lot of things she couldn't entirely explain since coming to this ridge. The blizzard hit on a Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, Creston had become a snow globe someone had forgotten to set down. She watched it through the reinforced porthole window she'd installed in October. A gray-white erasure of everything familiar. The kind of cold that didn't just threaten, it decided. The generator lines along the main road had already gone. She could see the dark gaps where the power poles had surrendered. Inside, it was 68 degrees. She ate breakfast at the small table she'd salvaged and refinished herself. Arugula and butter lettuce from the subterranean beds, still tender, still alive, grown under the amber glow of the full-spectrum panels 12 feet below where she sat. She'd drizzled them with the last of a good olive oil and a squeeze of lemon, and she ate slowly, with the kind of deliberate pleasure that had once been her armor at Kwan charity galas, and was now simply hers. No performance required, no table to impress. The radio crackled, Creston's volunteer emergency channel. A woman's voice, clipped and tired, listing the shelters that were already over capacity. Naomi turned it off. Not from cruelty, from clarity. There was nothing she could do about the town today, and she had learned, in these months on the mountain, the particular discipline of not borrowing catastrophe. Her moment would come. It was already coming. You could feel it the way you felt the hum, not yet visible, but absolutely present. She refilled her water from the cistern tap, still clean, still flowing, fed by the filtration system she'd built in stages with parts ordered under names the Kwan family's investigators would never think to trace. She thought about Tae-sung briefly. Not with longing, exactly, but with the cool, almost academic interest of a woman studying a past she no longer inhabits. He would be warm right now, comfortable, insulated by money and the belief that money was the same thing as safety. He had no idea what she had built underneath this frozen ground. The lettuce was crisp. The cabin held its heat. Outside, the blizzard pressed its full weight against the walls and found them indifferent. She had $17 once. She had a $5 deed and a hillside full of rock. While the Kwan family had billions, she almost felt sorry for the imbalance. Almost. Subscribe. Because the Kwans are about to find out what they threw away, and they are going to come begging. The knock came like a fist against bone, frantic, desperate, wrong. Naomi set down her tea and moved to the door without hurrying. She had learned, in the weeks since they'd left her here to disappear quietly into the mountain cold, that panic was a luxury she could no longer afford. She opened the door to the wind and the dark, and found them. Tae-sung first, his expensive coat torn at the shoulder, a cut above his brow bleeding in that slow, stubborn way that head wounds do. Behind him, clutching his arm with both hands, was Madame Kwan herself. The woman who had signed the papers. The woman who had smiled while doing it. She looked smaller out here. They both did. There was ice, Tae-sung said, like that explained everything. The cabin was the only light. Naomi looked at the cabin. The car went off the ridge road. We couldn't. There was no signal. And your cabin was the only light. Naomi looked at them for a long moment. The wind moved through the pines like a held breath. Then she stepped aside. She didn't fuss. She didn't speak more than was necessary. She stoked the fire until it roared copper and amber against the dark walls, and the warmth spread through the small room like something forgiving. She pressed a cloth to Tae-sung's brow and handed Madame Kwan a blanket without ceremony, without warmth, without any of the softness the older woman had once demanded from her as a birthright. Madame Kwan sat rigid in the wooden chair closest to the fire, her silk blouse ruined, her composure hanging by a thread she kept pulling tighter. She watched Naomi move through the small space, graceful, unhurried, entirely at home. And something flickered behind her eyes that she was not ready to name. Naomi's skin caught the firelight like polished wood, like something ancient and unbothered. She had been stripped of every luxury these people understood, and she had built herself a warmth they could not manufacture with all their money. "You could have turned us away," Tae-sung said quietly, when his mother was half drowsing against the blanket. Naomi didn't look up from the fire. Yes. The words sat between them, simple and total. She hadn't done it out of forgiveness. She hadn't done it out of love, or weakness, or the desperate hoping that used to live in her chest like an uninvited tenant. She had done it because she was Naomi Ellison, and Naomi Ellison did not become small, simply because small people had tried to make her so. The fire cracked and settled. Outside, the mountain held its cold silence. Madame Kwan's eyes opened slowly, and for the first time, she looked at her former daughter-in-law without the armor of contempt. What she found there shook something loose in her chest she could not put back. The black SUVs looked obscene parked against the backdrop of her valley. Naomi watched from the cabin doorway as the doors opened. Security first, then his mother, then Tae-sung himself, stepping onto land that had never heard his name until today. She didn't move. Let them come to her. They always made everyone come to them. Today, for once, they could walk. She saw the exact moment the valley silenced them. His mother's sharp eyes, eyes that had looked through Naomi for 3 years like she was decorative glass, moved slowly across the slope. The sheep, the fencing, clean and deliberate. The channel she'd carved to redirect the creek, water catching the afternoon light like hammered silver. The garden rose, the smoke curling from the stone chimney she'd built one boulder at a time. Taesung had stopped walking entirely. In 4 years of marriage, they were doing something she had never seen them do in 4 years of marriage. They were doing nothing at all. He was simply looking. His mother said something sharp in Korean. Naomi didn't need a translation. She'd heard that tone directed at assistants, at lawyers, at anyone foolish enough to exist in the woman's way. But Naomi noticed she didn't say it loudly. In the Valley had a way of making performance feel small. Naomi stepped back inside. She ladled stew into a ceramic bowl she'd traded 2 weeks of wool for at the supply post in town, thick with root vegetables and the lamb she'd processed herself, seasoned with dried herbs from the windowsill. She carried it outside and set it on the flat-topped fence post nearest to where Taesung had finally reached the yard. He stared at the bowl, then at her. For a moment she thought he might actually speak. Something real, something worth the altitude and the 6-hour drive and whatever version of guilt or strategy had brought him here. His mouth opened. She met his eyes with the same calm she'd carried through frozen mornings and bleeding hands and nights when $17 felt like a joke God was telling at her expense. "Eat," she said, "then leave." She turned and walked back inside, letting the door settle softly behind her. Not a slam. Naomi Ellison did not slam doors. She simply closed them. Through the window, she watched him pick up the bowl. Naomi didn't beg, didn't bow, and didn't break. She built. If that's the kind of story that finds something in your chest and pulls, subscribe to the Ari Armour family. Drop a comment below. What's the one thing they underestimated about her? Let's talk about it. Because a queen doesn't need permission to reign. She just needs $5 and the audacity to begin.